Hello and welcome to the programme bringing together BBC specialists with the correspondents who write, blog and broadcast for audiences in their own countries from the Dateline London. This week, Boris Johnson's finance minister opens the taxpayer's purse as the Prime Minister himself tries to persuade world leaders to open theirs to mitigate climate change. Plus, is famine stalking Afghanistan? Joining us to discuss all that, Henry Chu, Deputy News Editor at the LA Times, who keeps the show on the road whilst the US West Coast sleeps. Latika Burke, columnist for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia. And here in the studio, the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. Now, COP26, which begins in Glasgow this weekend, is supposed to be the moment when the world's nations present individual beefed-up pledges to mitigate climate change, agree rules to prevent double counting, and honour previously agreed plans to ensure the poorest countries too can adapt to survive. The summit's host, that perennial optimist Boris Johnson, says its success or failure is in the balance. The Queen, usually a valuable asset in the last-minute lobbying and arm-twisting that characterises summits, won't now be there. On medical advice, say courtiers. Still, Her Majesty was caught on microphone recently saying of COP26, it is very irritating when they talk, but they don't do. Henry, why might we now be in the realm of expectation management for this summit?
Well, certainly Boris Johnson has been, criticized by people as tending to overpromise and underachieve. But I think he's gone the opposite direction right now in underpromising in hopes that he might overachieve. He said that it's touch and go in terms of what might come out of this summit. We'll have a bit of a barometer of that in the G20 global summit that'll happen before COP26, because if you can't get 20 countries to play nice and come up with commitments that are binding and impressive enough for the rest of the world to follow, you're not going to get 200 countries nearly to agree on that. And the challenges before him are pretty daunting, and some of which he doesn't really have much leverage over. I mean, I think one of the foremost in my mind is the fact that right now the relationship between China and the US, the two biggest emitters of carbon gases and other greenhouse gases, is in a pretty dire shape. If you remember 6 years ago, 2015, before the Paris Agreement was struck, the two countries issuing a joint statement was actually critical for the rest of the world to come on board. And you had the visual of President Obama standing side by side with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Well, you're not going to have that at this conference. Xi is not attending in person. He's only going to appear virtually. And as I said, Washington and Beijing right now are at a low point in their relations, and neither one wants to be seen bowing or kowtowing to the other. There was some hope that maybe this could be a standalone issue where they would recognize the good of the planet and not just of their own national interests, but I think that's going to be kind of difficult. And one other thing that you mentioned too, Sean, about rich countries stepping up to the plate and coughing up the money that they had pledged, which was $100 billion a year to help the poorer nations adjust to the ravages of climate change. Well, they haven't been doing that either. It's only been about mustering maybe 80% of that $100 billion, and they say they probably won't get to that $100 billion mark for another few years. So that's going to be discouraging for poorer countries to hear, who already this year have seen rich countries not making good on their vaccination pledges through COVAX.
Latika, Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, said this week or in the last few days that he's come up with a uniquely Australian solution, having been one of the laggards in this international debate on climate change. Tell us more.
Well, the Australian way, as the Prime Minister likes to refer to it, is deeply unambitious in the short term. Now, we shouldn't understate just how significant it is for a Prime Minister of Australia to stand up and say, we are going to commit to net zero by 2050, which is what he said this week, and for him to still remain in the job the next day. This is extraordinary. This hasn't happened in Australian politics for at least a decade. In fact, we have played musical chairs with our prime ministers and political leaders over this very diabolical issue of climate change politics in Australia. So it is remarkable, and it is a huge step forward for Australia that that the community and the politics have come to some sort of consensus here. But when you dig a little deeper, you begin to understand why. And that's because the Prime Minister has said that oil, gas will remain in the next foreseeable future. In fact, he's made a virtue of the fact that we are going to continue mining in Australia. We are going to continue exploring in Australia. And you will see the Prime Minister of Australia join with China and India this weekend at the G20 in trying to fight off a move to set a phase-out date for coal. So it's not the best company that those in Australia who have been pushing for better climate change targets would have liked to have seen.
How do they square that, though, with the problem for the Asia-Pacific region in particular? 1.5 billion people living on coasts. You can carry on with carbon, you can carry on building your economy on that, but it becomes harder and harder to find the carbon to burn, to create the fossil fuels. And you're having to spend all that money mitigating the damaging environmental effects. Is nobody making that case in Asian political leadership, or is it just too politically combustible?
Look, there is some optimism, and one of the big shifts that's happened in Australia is really centred around technology. And you hear the Australian Prime Minister say this all the time: technology, not taxes. And what you have in Australia is the business community now picking up this mantle for itself, taking on what it knows is the future, and looking around and saying, OK, now we have some settled agreement politically about where this regulatory environment's going to take us. We can start to really plan for the future. So just this week, for instance, there are two really interesting of many Australian companies here in the UK and heading to COP and going to be addressing COP. One is this really fascinating company called Sun Cable. It's going to build an enormous solar farm in the Northern Territory where it's desert, and then through undersea cables send that electricity via Indonesian waters to Singapore, because Singapore, constrained by its own geography, can't create huge solar farms like Australia can. Now, that project is being backed by an Australian billionaire, Andrew Forrest, who's here because he made his billions in iron ore, but now wants to turn his company into a green hydrogen energy exporter. So there are a lot of people in Australia who are seeing the opportunities, knowing that they can transform the Australian economy and not make Australia poorer along the way.
Now, that question of opportunities, but also who pays for the transition, is a huge one for the business community, isn't it, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, one way or another, every citizen in the world will pay for this. We either pay through our taxes, or we pay through the amount we pay for the products and services that we consume. And, you know, the cost of this is going to be astronomical.
I mean, that's the problem with the fossil fuel stuff, isn't it? It gets more and more expensive to sustain where we are, never mind to grow that.
Well, there are some bits which are quite easy wins. So in the UK, for example, we've had a huge success with offshore wind. It's a big part of our energy mix now.
Even the Prime Minister used to joke about wind power, didn't he, when he was a journalist? And now he's a big champion.
Well, a lot of people thought it was impossible to get it below £100 per megawatt hour. It's now £40. So we've had enormous success in that. But actually decarbonising the power supply is kind of the easy bit. You can do that through offshore wind. You can do it through renewables. Nuclear has a role. We know that the government is moving towards approving a new nuclear power plant here. The really tough stuff is in making stuff like steel, cement. And on that, you really do need new technology. You need something called carbon capture and storage. So at the point when you're burning the energy, you can actually suck it back out of the atmosphere and then bury it down underneath the ground. For example, the UK's got a fantastic resource in that. It's got declining, depleted oil fields off the North Sea coast. That's the idea. But that technology is in its infancy. We're nowhere near that yet. Now, the Prime Minister of the UK's favourite word at the moment right now is hydrogen. If you said hydrogen 100 times in a row, you'd get any job that you wanted in the cabinet. And basically, a lot of people have twigged onto that. So, for example, the nuclear power people are saying any excess heat we'll use to generate extra hydrogen. That can be used in heavy industry. It can be used in long-haul transport. And indeed, there's a lot of talk about getting renewables to make hydrogen as well. But the point is that the UK represents 1% of global emissions. The bill for doing this by 2050 is £1 trillion. So if you times that by 100, you know the costs are absolutely astronomical. Obviously, climate activists would rightly say the cost of not doing this are even worse. But nevertheless, when you put that kind of money in, by the way, it's not just sunk cost. When you create these new industries, there's something called a multiplier effect. You create jobs, that creates taxes. You create new industries, which can offset some of that investment. But be under no illusion, the costs are absolutely phenomenal.
Henry, Joe Biden will travel from Rome to Glasgow, going first to the G20, where he spends part of the weekend, and then on to Glasgow for COP26. But he's arriving without congressional agreement on his big infrastructure bill, which was supposed to be, in part, about climate change and tackling it. Is there any sign of coherent leadership in America yet on this question, whether it's city, state or federal level?
Well, certainly on the federal level, there are still a couple of days yet where perhaps the Democrats can end their squabbling and come up with a credible funding plan that Biden can present at COP26. I mean, it's fairly remarkable package still, even in its slimmed down state. We're talking about $500 billion in incentives and other measures to try to encourage climate change fighting technologies and behavioral changes. So if he could actually arrive in Glasgow with that in hand, I think that would actually obviously increase the U.S.'s credibility on the global stage with this. But then you go down to lower levels of state and city levels, as you say, and unfortunately, it's the same political divide that we see on the national level happening at the micro level as well. So you've got liberal cities like my own, Los Angeles, or New York, signing up to this worldwide pledge with other big cities to divest their public funds from fossil fuel companies. But then you have other cities that are not doing so much. You have my state, California, where the governor recently, just a few weeks ago, unveiled a $15 billion package to fight climate change. And then you have the governor of Texas, where, to be fair, it's actually a fairly big producer of wind energy. But when Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, warned Texas that it needed to stop being so over-reliant on oil and gas, Abbott, the governor, actually tweeted 2 words, which were pound sand. So it's unfortunate that we're going to be seeing the same kind of polarization repeated on local levels as we see already on the federal level.
Brief last point on this, Simon.
On this question about whether pension funds should divest from oil and gas and other carbon-intensive stuff, that will be a big debate at COP26. And there's a big argument. Is it better to say we're going to sell our shares in Exxon, Shell, BP, or do you try and engage with those businesses? And a lot of the oil majors will tell you, if you divest yourself and just sell them, that doesn't mean this stuff isn't going to happen. It'll just be picked, those assets will be hoovered up by people perhaps less transparent, with less commitment to trying to do this. So the question about to divest or engage will be a really key one with people like BlackRock, the big money managers. They're the masters of the universe in some ways, and they will have a big say on how this goes.
Thank you very much. Well, the UK's Finance Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was certainly managing expectations this week. His budget and spending plans for the next 3 years included the largest increase in taxes in almost 30 years. Not that you'd have known it. The budget, declared Rishi Sunak, was helping to create a new age of optimism, which includes the highest tax burden since the 1950s. Now that is chutzpah. I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek, Simon, but there are kind of quite serious questions about it. I mean, is it possible to square Rishi Sunak's rhetoric with the reality of the measures he's introducing?
I think you have to take this budget with the last one. We've seen some of the biggest tax rises we've seen in a generation. It added 50 billion to the tax, as you say, the highest tax burden since the 1950s. Now, what happened was back in March, he said, listen, we've had a 1 in a 300-year event. I've paid the wages of 11 million workers at some place. Payback was inevitable. And people kind of sucked it up and said, OK, that's fine. We realise that there's a bill to pay for this. But new economic numbers came out and said, actually, it's not quite as catastrophic as we thought. In fact, you've got plenty more money than you thought you would have. And the question was he going to give that back or was he going to spend it anyway? So he banked a little bit and spent a lot, mainly on health. So the size of the state now is at levels we haven't seen since the 1970s. Some say this is just accepting the reality. We have an aging population where the health costs are really, really high. Right at the end of his budget, he kind of gave this weird little moment where he said, I didn't really want to do this. It's not, this is not who I am. I
was
want
he looking
to be.
At Boris Johnson?
He was sort of, I want to be a tax-cutting, fiscally traditional chancellor. And he said in an interview with the BBC that he hopes to cut those taxes towards the end of this parliament. But certainly the Conservative Party is in a rather peculiar position and has certainly put the opposition Labour Party in a bit of a fix. Where do they go? When you've got the state this size, they've spent so much money. He'd like to cut taxes, but it doesn't look like he's going to be able to do that very soon. Yeah. And a lot of people thinking that this new timetable means an election will be a bit later. A lot of people thinking they were gearing up for a big tax cut in 2023 ahead of an election. Maybe it's going to be a little bit further away than that.
Is it possible to look at this and say that this is a government which has got a balance right between not just the haves and the have-nots, but the generations? Indeed, Simon there was talking about a big increase in spending on health, yet at the same time he was announcing the good news that schools are now going to get as much money per pupil as they got 10 years ago. I mean, the balance of this, it's questionable, isn't it?
Yes, and on international aid, which I think is really gone overlooked in this whole debate, because that was one of the first things that Rishi Sunak cut in the name of the pandemic, saying, gee, the finances are so terrible, we can't possibly afford to help the poor, as we'd committed to, both sides of Parliament, in legislation tied to gross national income. Now, that's not going up anytime soon, yet suddenly they have found this money for all the other things, like the overhaul of booze taxes. They can make it cheaper to fly domestically in the UK, but they can't find the money to restore that original promise, which is actually tied to gross national income anyway. It's not actually a lump sum that they then have to tweak back. It's like always paired the way that aid is spending. Of gross national income, that's right. So it naturally tapers down as the economy expands or contracts. But, Rishi Sunak saying this at the end of his budget reminds me of this great line that Kevin Rudd, a Labor Prime Minister, in 2007, when he was on track to win his landslide victory over a Conservative Prime Minister, he came out and said, people called me a fiscal conservative. Well, a very enterprising journalist went back and looked at history and no one had ever called him a fiscal conservative. So I think Rishi Sunak may be wanting a little self-describing mojo for himself too.
To quote Shakespeare, think the lady doth protest too much. Henry, budget balance to be admired or to be doubted, do you think?
Well, I certainly think to be questioned, as we would of any party that's in power, not just the Conservatives. But to go back to Simon's point of, comparing this to what happened a year ago, well, let's also think about what's happened over 10 years, and that is that the Conservatives in power, not just under Boris Johnson, of course, but back when David Cameron was Prime Minister, instituted fairly crippling austerity cuts that we hadn't seen also since World War II. We keep talking about these huge generational shifts. So the fact that health is going to be back to that 2010 level, education is back to that 2010 level, health has actually been okay, and so is the Home Office, but plenty of other departments are not going to necessarily find that they're back in flush as they were even a little bit over a decade ago. And of course, we still have that bugbear of inflation, right? I mean, they're pegging it at between 4 to 5% next year. Now, that's going to cut into people's spending power, and that includes the government's own spending power. And each percentage point, or even half a percentage point that inflation goes up, is just going to make all this a little bit tougher on Sunak and Johnson as the year goes by.
I think that's a really important point, that inflation was the thing that stalked this budget. It stalks the economy in the UK as around the world, and that even though all of this spending, hey big spender, was spending spree were the headlines in the UK, a lot of people will not feel that things are actually getting better. They won't feel the benefit of that because with inflation and indeed a rise in employee tax contributions, you're going to need to see wage increases of 5% just to stand still in that inflationary environment. So lots of spending. Will you feel the benefit? Feel a glow about that? Probably not.
Maybe not quite that new age of optimism just yet. Thank you. Now, the Chancellor was able to delete one line of expenditure this week. 20 years of funding a military presence in Afghanistan has ended. A different sort of funding may already be needed, though, aid to avert famine. Afghanistan is bankrupt and the Taliban is floundering. Challenged in the House of Commons to help, Boris Johnson said the UK couldn't write a completely blank cheque for a country which risks becoming again a haven for growing opium and cultivating terrorism. Latika, regional foreign ministers were meeting in Tehran on Friday and it ended by issuing a statement calling for more international assistance. Australia is one country that had a military presence and has done things like, for example, take Afghan refugees who wanted to flee the Taliban. Is there a sense in the region that realistically people are going to have to get involved again one way or another?
Well, it was interesting to see this week that the Australian government committed another $100 million to foreign aid or in humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. Now, it's very well for me to criticise the British, but Australia's foreign aid contributions are absolutely paltry. I think it's 0.21% of GNI. So we're not a big donor, we're not a big giver, and we're not very generous when it comes to foreign aid. So this is a bit of a substantial donation from Australia that the government sent this week. And clearly that is the only lever really that Australia sees much of the West having over the Taliban. Now, overall, Australia has spent over 2 decades $1.5 billion in trying to develop Afghanistan. And the question that the Australian government has for its voters is, well, was that worth it? Because look what's happened at the end of those 2 decades. We have handed Afghanistan back, wrapped with a bow on top, to the Taliban.
Henry, what about the impact on this in Washington? We have only just had the debate about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think there was a senator this week calling for a committee of an inquiry to be set up to consider exactly this question and being very critical of President Biden's policy. How much concern is there in Washington about how you engage with the Taliban and how you ensure that this doesn't turn into not just a humanitarian crisis of famine, but also further deterioration and yet again the breeding ground for international terrorism?
I think, and it's something that might be even more fearful to Americans than the Taliban in charge in Afghanistan is a failed state in Afghanistan, just as you say, and that it becomes a geopolitical nightmare, a morass that the region and the rest of the world will have to suffer with. I think the U.S. has recognized that. So just like Australia, having just announced some more aid yesterday, the U.S. said that it was going to pledge another $144 million, and that'll raise its overall amount this year to 600 million plus. Of course, a lot of that was pledged before the Taliban took over in August. Now, the fear is that money will not be directed in the right way, and they don't want to fund the Taliban, so they're still going to funnel it through NGOs and other groups to try to make sure that the Taliban itself is not benefiting from this. But we are talking about a humanitarian disaster in the making for a country whose budget in the past was 75% foreign aid. So you really do need these donors to step up. And then the fact that the Taliban itself isn't equipped to be able to distribute any of this aid if it had it in its own hands. Well, 120,000 people or more were evacuated from Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul. Many of those people are professionals, well-trained engineers, economists, many of them women, whom the Taliban is now not allowing to work. And they've lost a real serious human resource right there. So this is really staring them in the face right now as the winter comes on.
It's a huge challenge, Simon. I mean, business too played a big part in the development of Afghanistan. I think there were some contractors Friday demonstrating, saying, look, we built this stuff and then the World Bank won't pay us the money because it won't allow any money to go back into Afghanistan. Meanwhile, NGOs play a big role in distributing the aid so governments don't have to involve themselves. It's a messy picture.
Well, you've got the World Food Programme saying we've got the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world developing there. There's a stage of 1 to 5 of emergency food situation. We've got 47% of the country are either in 3 or 4, which is either critical or emergency, and that we're going into the winter months. I think one of the other things that the international community has to figure out is, are they going to recognise and deal with the Taliban, yes or no? There's still $9 billion of foreign assets frozen outside Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think the Afghan foreign minister has been lobbying in Doha this week to European foreign ministers saying, let us have that money at least.
That money, yeah. I mean, so the question is, are we going to deal with the Taliban, yes or no? Do we hold our nose and deal with them and and free this money on the basis that if we don't, we're going to see the economy, which has already collapsed. There's absolutely no way of getting it back. I think that a lot of people around the world feel slightly embarrassed, ashamed even, about the way that Afghanistan was left there, very vulnerable to the kind of economic and famine shocks that we're seeing. There are aid is getting in, and the Taliban are not preventing it getting in because they do not want a failed state on their hands. They don't want to say the minute we take over, the entire country collapses. That is not in their best interests either. But how those channels will work and to what extent you begin to sort of recognise the Taliban as a legitimate government, I think is a really big political question, and one I don't think that there is any international consensus on right now. And whilst we wait for that consensus, I'm afraid the situation is deteriorating in a really tragic way. There was a very interesting report, I recommend everyone watch it, Yogita Lamai, the BBC's correspondent, saying that tragically some people are being forced to sell their children in order to get enough food. It's a very hard watch, but I think if you want a portrait of what's going on there, I would give that a look.
Yeah, it's a sombre note to end on, but a very important one. That can be found on various BBC resources online or in the UK on the BBC iPlayer. Latika Burke, Henry Chu and Samjat, thank you all very much. Thank you too for watching. Don't forget, of course, two challenges still facing the Taliban. One is the opium trade, which has been a huge problem in the times even of the Western occupation. Heroin was still getting from the opium fields of Afghanistan to the streets of the West. Well, that's a good financial resource if the Taliban want to use it. And then, of course, the threat of terrorist activity from groups allied to the Islamic State. From all of us on Dateline London, goodbye.